While we're walking down to the tree that I'm going to sit and draw, let me point out something incredibly important about drawing natural bushland scenes or trees. Have a look at this view. See the wonderful depth, the wonderful separation we have between all the plants and trees and shrubs, even though it's very dense. But when we suddenly stop, look how different it suddenly looks. In a moment, I'll pause the camera and look how cluttered the scene becomes. Without the movement to help us separate depth, suddenly it's a tangle of foliage. It's very hard to see what's close and what's further away. This is incredibly important when we draw from photos because we lose this sense of depth that we have here that we can see when we walk and we can see in real life. One last example before we get to our tree, but just see the difference that seeing depth in life or when we're moving in a video and when subtly we're seeing from one shot, because that's what happens when we draw from a photo. We have to put the depth back in to our drawing that the photo, such as here, has cut out. And here we are at our tree. Now it's not these two closest ones in the center right, but this one here now that I'm zooming in on and panning up and down to give a sense of the foliage and perhaps some separation from the foliage in the far distance. I'm only going to draw the tree, not the surrounds. And it's the wonderful twisting, curving branches that I really want to try and capture in this. Now, here's the bottom 2/3 of the tree. And in fact, it extends further up and to the right. But this is a good sense of the branching without it all getting too small. And this was my first pause point. Now, I started here drawing this section in here, and this section is actually in the upper half of the tree. Generally, I like to start somewhere in the center because that lets me plot the proportions up and down and out from that starting point, and hopefully it lets me center and get most of the subject, in this case a tree, in my scene. Back to location, panning upwards a little bit to show you the top part of the tree, which wasn't in that photo, that I'm going to want to include in my drawing. And here we are. Quick pan back down just while I stood up and restored circulation to the bottom half of my body. Right now, I just want to zoom in and show you the focus point of the branching, I think, for visual interest, and that's this incredibly convoluted twisting and turning. And I'm just about to draw that part now. And so I've just started to sketch that out. I'm using a 0.3 millimeter Copic multiliner pen here. And just another look at the foliage that I'm actually starting on at this part of the drawing. The foliage just as important, obviously, as the branching in a drawing of a tree. If we just go back to that last spot in the drawing, I want to point out that the base of the tree that we have here, which pretty much is the finished drawing base of the tree, is actually about here. This really is where my drawing finishes. The other thing in the glimpse of the earlier stage, I don't know if you noticed, but this section here, I'd actually mapped this out without this connection or this connection. I just stuck it into space because I wanted to position this in relation to this section of trunk which I had already drawn. And it's quite clear at this early stage that I'm drawing this whole tree slightly too large for what I was hoping to capture. This stage also shows my way of drawing particularly curving and twisting curving branches in sections. I always avoid a long continuous line. It's very hard to get that accurate. It's hard to get the widths relative to each other of the trunk and branches accurate. I also find it makes it harder to get the extreme twistiness accurate. This is a far more satisfactory way, I find, to get the curvature. The other thing I also do at times is I place curvature lines, such as here, to help me remember that this isn't a flat ribbon, it's a three-dimensional pipe, these lines here. I'll strengthen these later on in the drawing, But at this stage, it helps remind me that this is basically a twisting and curving, turning pipe. I'm also starting to position the foliage. I find that establishing where the foliage is meant to be before I try and connect it to the branches helps keep my tree in overall proportion. If we draw the branches first, it's easier to end up making my branches too long and distorting the overall shape, size, and look of the tree. Here's my next stopping point, pause point. Just to have a look, I've pushed the foliage up to the top. There's a view of the top part of the tree where you can see that upper foliage. And you'll notice I'm trying to establish where the main clumps are without worrying too much about the branches up there. And I've left the noises of the bush, the birds, the creek in the gorge below. Hopefully you can hear those as well. Here's a better look at that stage from a screenshot from the video. Our original section that we started with is here. Not really done much more with the branches except to add a few more, particularly adding the branches that are closest to us, which will then enable me to position the main ones that go behind accurately enough. Leaves hang in a certain way on different trees according to the type of tree. In this tree, there very much is this effect. They're relatively large leaves for the distance we're seeing them from, and they hang fairly vertically down, except when they're smaller at the ends of branches, when they tend to become a little more horizontal. But I'm particularly trying to establish where some of these clumps of foliage are so that I can link the branches up. And in my sketchbook, this is very much the top of my page. Here was my next pause point. We'll have a closer look at that in a screenshot of that scene, but now another look at the tree and at what I'm focusing on. And take you down, give you a glimpse of the creek in the bottom of the gorge there. And here is my seat, the end of an old telegraph pole. In this next phase of the drawing, I've been working at creating a sense of 3 dimensions now in my branches. I'm thinking more about the finish marks that we'll see, using what I've drawn so far as initial exploration, but now's the time to start getting a feel for how will my drawing look at the end, what marks will be there, how much detail will I give, how will I create the effect of the foliage, how many branches will I show. And a reminder that this original part that we first looked at is here. With this section of foliage, I've actually crossed the binding of my sketchbook and I've gone right to the top here. Emphasis on these marks because I want to make sure I'm getting a sense of 3 dimensions in what I'm drawing so that I can build on that. The other important thing is with the foliage, even though it's in a relatively shallow plane in terms of the depth of plane of the total drawing, when I think of this tree very close here and I think of these trees on the other side of the gorge, then all of this foliage is at a very similar distance from me, from the closest parts of it here to the furthest parts of it through parts that we glimpse. In terms of my drawing, I want to exaggerate that a little. I want to create the feeling that some parts of this are actually closer than other parts. So, as is particularly the case with trees, foliage is becoming my focus and my challenge in this next stage of the drawing, and also getting my final marks on the trunk here. I've run these next 2 stages, one on from the other, as it's really developing more of the same. You can get a good sense of how I've gone over the page, and I would have liked to have gone over the page in that upper right corner, but alas, no page to go on to. Another glimpse of the top part of that tree. You can see that my view of the upper part of the tree really was hidden by these 2 larger trees, which was a bit of a shame. But that's where my seat was. And so here we have again with a little more foliage added into the upper parts and into the further back parts of the foliage. And again, looking up, looking down, looking up, looking down. If we draw on location, we all know that feeling. At this stage, having added some additional foliage into the canopy, I thought I'd finish, but having a look over it, particularly in that lower right section, I thought that branch that moves into a further direction from the tree didn't quite look clear enough, didn't quite come forward enough. And so in this stage, I'd added a little more emphasis to the foliage of that further branch that was still closer to us than the rest of that foliage, just to give a sense of 3 dimensions and connection to our tree with that section. And I think that worked really well. It's always important to have one last look. So let's have a look at this now in the studio in the sketchbook. Can't say I've used this book much at all. This was my first and last drawing before Sydney went into lockdown in, I think it was 2021. This was a preparatory sketch for another location sketch I was doing where I just wanted to work out some issues with the top of the Sydney Post Office Tower. But here we have our tree. You can see the overall effect that I was going for. I think it works well to have strengthened down here this clump of foliage just to link it with this tree rather than risk it looking like a separate tree further away. This particular gum has a very rough bark, and so I tried to use marks that would reflect that. You can see all of the hatching lines that I used to both emphasize the branches and create distinction at times from the foliage, but also to give a sense of direction, some of the curvature on some of these hatchings, to underscore not just the value or the local colour, but also the form of the surface that they are on. You'll also notice that at times I haven't just drawn leaves, but I've done loose hatching over a whole bundle of leaves, which is to help create the effect of the colour rather than of the shapes. So often we actually perceive leaves as a massive value rather than as individual leaves. Even in this case where the leaves were relatively large, larger in fact for their distance from me than is often the case with the trees I draw. So this was in fact my first plein air drawing in ink of a tree. I had a lot of fun. I don't think it will be my last. Why don't you grab a bit of paper or a sketchbook and a pen and go and find a tree now? G'day, I'm Stephen Travers, but in the end, whatever you draw, however it turns out, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.